I am Ulysses S. Grant, 18th President of the United States. And you join me today in my parlor. And I will reflect and talk a bit about the whiskey ring, the debacle that it was, and ultimately what I have characterized on several occasions as the most bitter disappointment of my life, the betrayal of a friend. Going into my second term, there were rumors of illegalities in the collection of revenue taxes from liquor distilleries. Now, what had happened that bred this unfortunate circumstance was during the war, President Lincoln imposed a 70-cent per gallon tax on whiskey to raise money for the war effort. That continued into the tax did, the Johnson administration, and indeed into my administration. I was not aware of it. Initially, from the beginning, people began to scheme about how to avoid it, and I would imagine very little ever got into the government coffers to support the war effort. And it became a game, and then it became a very serious criminal enterprise to avoid this taxation. And the numbers are staggering. The distilleries were producing 15 to 18 million gallons of whiskey per year. And as it turned out, only about 2/3 at best of that whiskey had this additional tax on it. That 70 cents was being divided 35 cents to the collection agencies and or the collection agents and various other people involved in the chain of supply from distilling to putting it on the boat or train to ship. The other 35 cents went to the distillers. In fact, it was so lucrative that by my presidency, the 4 or 5 principal people from 1874, November 74 to November of 1875 had each gotten $45,000 to $60,000 in their pockets from this enterprise, and 4 primary distilleries got the same amount of money. So it's well over $250,000 to individuals and to 4 distilleries. It was a sieve of Treasury money that was not getting to the Treasury. And after the war, it became a political slush fund, and in about 1870, it became solidified to fund Republican nominees for election. Then it became a criminal organization. It was widespread, deep-rooted. Virtually every Treasury agent was involved. All 16 at least distilleries from St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Chicago, the largest centers of it, all the way to New Orleans and points both east and west of the Mississippi River. It was a monstrous cabal of bilking the government. And it had become a criminal enterprise as well, deeply rooted organized crime. A lot of money went to Republican candidates, but even more, I suspect, went into the pockets of everybody involved in the process. In June of 1874, I changed Treasury secretaries, and Benjamin H. Bristow was appointed the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, he's the first of the major actors in this cabal. Benjamin Bristow was the Secretary of the Treasury. John D. McDonald, General John D. McDonald, an illiterate individual that I had met during the war, knew him vaguely but liked him. I appointed him in an effort to get a new person in St. Louis to try to collect this money to the post in St. Louis, and he was the chief revenue collector for the St. Louis area and 6 states and the Indian Territories. But he became one of the major figures in the criminal activities. He was the linchpin between Washington and St. Louis and the other distilleries. I defended him to the last and thought him to be a man of character. His nomination was opposed by Senator Carl Schurz in Missouri, where I had always had trouble, didn't carry Missouri in the election. And Schurz was leading the liberal Republicans, which was a breakaway faction from the Republican Party, of which I had been elected president. And he became a bitter enemy. So Schurz opposed John D. McDonnell being appointed collector of the Treasury revenue in St. Louis. I appointed him anyway. Another actor in this was the U.S. Attorney General David T. Dyer in St. Louis County, and Dyer was committed to aggressively pursuing the illegalities in what he suspected was deeply rooted and widespread, and it was indeed both. The Treasury solicitor, Bluford Wilson, which is an attorney investigating, became very prominent in this and pursuing avidly the prosecutions of individuals that were locked up. Some 300 arrested, 218 indicted, 110 convicted, recovering about $3 million when all the dam burst and all of this came to light. You've also got John B. Henderson, former Senator Henderson, and I appointed him as a special prosecutor, the first special prosecutor in any federal investigation. So I appointed the first man to have that job, John B. Henderson, and he was sent to St. Louis with great avidity, which he did, until he criticized and implicated me. Then I replaced him, but he was involved in the prosecution of the whiskey ring. So I have the distinction of appointing the first special prosecutor and the distinction of firing the first special prosecutor and replacing him with an attorney, a Democrat attorney, James Broadhead. And I appointed the Democrat because he was a distinguished jurist, a man of stellar stainless character, and I wanted bipartisan influence ringing from this investigation. There's also another distinction that I hold in this sordid matter that I'll talk about in a moment. The last character that I would lift up is my good friend, right arm, my primary secretary in the White House, Orville E. Babcock. Babcock joined me when we were in the Vicksburg program campaign and had been with me through the rest of the war. Indeed, he was with Lee waiting for me to get to the McLean House at Appomattox. I kept him during my administration as General of the Army in the Johnson presidency, and then brought him with me as my chief secretary when I came to the executive mansion. He was also appointed Inspector of Federal Buildings in Washington, D.C., which was his official title. He also still held the rank of Major in the United States Army, which also will come into play momentarily. But it turned out that Babcock was indeed the primary character in all of this because, well, let me go back to Bristow being appointed Secretary of the Treasury. Bristow took office in the summer of 1874, June of 1874, and got wind not long afterward of the whiskey ring, as it became known, or rings in some 16 different cities. And he looked into the matter, and he went to St. Louis on more than one occasion to inspect books and accountancy and look at the process of the distilling. But he was frustrated because every time he got to St. Louis, or indeed any other distillery, everything was in order, even though he knew there was something wrong. And he was probing and looking about, and the editor of one of the St. Louis Democrat contacted him privately and said, if you want someone who can help you with this investigation, you need to contact Myron Colony, who was the business reporter for the St. Louis Democrat, Missouri Democrat. And Bristow did so. Colony told him the whole sordid mess as he knew it. they decided with Bluford Wilson, the Solicitor General, to hire independent agents, not Treasury agents, because they were all involved in the cabal. So Colony recommended individuals he knew to be of character, and then began his investigation officially, going around to the steamboats, particularly the steamboat landings, and investigating the books. Now, he was well known to be the business reporter and frequently wrote very complimentary articles, so he was not only not suspected, he was welcomed on the boats and in the warehouses and at the distilleries. So Myron Colony and his agents, who had been made Treasury agents, looked at to start with, the grain going into the distilleries. How much material ingredients went into the distilleries, how much whiskey went out. And also he found that they were distilling at night, which was definitely illegal. That's when all that whiskey was untaxed. And so he compiled the ingredient amounts coming into the distilleries there in St. Louis and other distilleries. And then he went and he matched the output of the liquor and goes to the steamboats and measured the amount of whiskey that was loaded on those boats for transport everywhere, and matched those numbers with the distillery ingredient numbers, the amount of alcohol that was produced, including the night distilled alcohol, whiskey, and found out that at best, optimistically, only 2/3 of the whiskey being made in the country, some 15 to 18 million gallons of whiskey annually. At best, only 2/3 of it was being taxed. He began to want to issue indictments, and he struck on May the 10th of 1875 and arrested U.S. Attorney General David P. Dyer in St. Louis directed it, the investigation and the net, and they arrested 300 people and charged them. Of the 300, 238 were indicted, and of the 238 that were indicted, 110 were convicted. And as I said earlier, about $3 million was collected. Now, Orville Babcock became involved because Bluford Wilson, the Solicitor General, and Benjamin Bristow, Secretary of the Treasury, had gotten hold of paperwork, messages, and telegrams that had been sent to John D. McDonald, the Treasury collector in St. Louis, 6 states and the Indian Territories, and they were all signed in code name Sylph. Well, that was easily tracked back down to Orville E. Babcock. In fact, Babcock, it turned out, had been given some $25,000, conservatively estimated, $25,000 in cash that was actually sent to him at the White House that he got at his desk, and he was opening this illegal cash in the room, the office outside my own. And he would sign these telegrams Sylph, code like when somebody was going to inspect the disease is spreading outside Washington, D.C., look to yourselves, or unwanted visitors may call, absent yourself in the city, folderol like that. In his own handwriting. The original telegrams were in his handwriting. He sent one to John D. McDonald, and he said, remove yourself, or remove this individual. And that is a specific telegram that Benjamin Bristow brought to Babcock, and he was such a glib liar. He said, oh no, that didn't, I wasn't talking about agents visiting. That was talking about McDonald removing another man, and he had told me that was the case. I adamantly told Secretary Bristow that doesn't have anything to do with the whiskey ring, that Babcock has told me so. And Bristow looked at me and he said, "Mr. President, this refers to a move that was made in December of 1874, and the telegram is dated February of 1875. It couldn't have referred back to that particular movement." So Babcock was caught in lie after lie, but I was being given information from Babcock, from McDonald, from Carl Schurz, who had become a bitter political opponent, that Bristow had presidential ambitions for the 76 nomination instead of me. And I was being talked about it, and I believed them. I believed that Bristow was being politically motivated, wanted to make a name for himself. It was said of him that he was endowed with ambition and principles, and the first got in the way of a very sticky second. His ambition and his principles clashed, I thought. So I was paying him no attention, and besides, I said angrily, if Babcock is lying to me, it's the greatest act in the history of mankind. That man is sterling. He's wonderful. He is not lying to me. He's not involved in this. So he was indicted. And I got the word just before a cabinet meeting. He was to go to trial in the first week of February of 1876. And I took the letter, the information that he's going to be indicted, and read it to my cabinet. They were all shocked, or feigned being shocked. And I said, I'm going to St. Louis to testify in his behalf. Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, and the rest of the cabinet actually were horrified. And I wouldn't hear their objections. I was going. He was my friend. And Fish, though, prevailed on me. He said, Mr. President, you can't go and foster the circus that would be your going into the courthouse and testifying in defense of a man who's been charged with cheating the government long, deep, and frequently. Besides that, the reason being, you represent the government which is prosecuting Babcock. You cannot be at loggerheads with your own government, of which you are the representative, to defend someone being prosecuted by that government. And I agreed, yes, but I still want to help him. Fish said, do a deposition. So I took a deposition in the White House in defense of Babcock. So I hold the distinction of being the only president to have ever been deposed in defense of a defendant in a criminal case. And there are those who say it was my testimony that got Babcock acquitted. Babcock is the only figure, the major figure in all those 110 convictions, all the 238 indictments, that was acquitted. Moreover, just 10 days before the trial, I sent word to U.S. Attorney General David P. Dyer in St. Louis County that nobody would be granted immunity for the testimony. And Dyer was aghast, so was Bristow, Secretary of Treasury Bristow, Bluford, Wilson. They were all outraged. They said, if you do this, you have gutted the prosecution because people are not going to testify. One of Babcock's defense attorneys released that statement, somehow got it to the papers, and the next day, young journalist Joseph Pulitzer, he may have a future in journalism. He's certainly making a splash in St. Louis because he took this. The New York paper had it, printed it, his paper, and he took it to Attorney General David P. Dyer, and he said, is there any truth to this? As it was being printed. He didn't wait for a denial or confirmation. And that hit the papers. Well, what had already been a circus of immense proportions, they had actually had to enlarge the room, the courtroom, because so many people wanted to get in, and they still were piled up and crowded in the streets outside the courtroom. As this drama unfolded in the national papers day after day, people are being convicted right and left. Babcock has been indicted, his trial is coming up, and the president is testifying in his defense. Babcock sensed that he might be convicted. He came to me and said he wanted a military inquiry. That would remove him from the civilian court and put him in a military tribunal because he still was a major in the Army. I was all for it. Appointed Sheridan to head it, a couple of other generals that were going to be the inquiry, but David P. Dyer, the Attorney General in St. Louis, refused to turn over the grand jury evidence that had been gathered against Babcock. And he went to the grand jury to reaffirm this. Grand jury handed back a decision that because this is a civilian trial that's trying to be moved to a military tribunal, that no evidence was going to be released outside St. Louis County. So there are some opposites. I said that nobody was going to get immunity for testifying against Babcock. The grand jury said Babcock is not going to escape this net. He's not going to go to the military where it was felt most likely be exonerated, remove him from civilian and put him in military, because this was not a military question. And don't try to make it one. So they refused to give the information out. So Babcock had to go to trial. And he was acquitted. He's the only one that was acquitted. But Babcock was acquitted. And I refused to accept that a man so close to me, a man that I thought so much of, so deeply, would be lying to me. Still didn't believe it. And he was acquitted, it's strongly felt, on the basis of my deposition. On the way back to Washington City, though, while Babcock was coming back, I was given incontrovertible, irrefutable information that Babcock had been involved in the gold ring back in September of '69 when Fisk and Gould had tried to corner the market of gold, which would have ruined the world economy. It would have been global in its impact. And I did not know that he was involved. In fact, he was so involved that when I released the government gold to stop any ability on the part of Fisk and Gould to corner the market, that Babcock had personally lost $40,000. And I realized I had to accept it. There was no denying. And I realized if he was guilty in that, he was also guilty in the whiskey ring. And it was absolutely devastating to me. I have characterized that as being the worst event in my life, being deceived by a friend, specifically by Babcock. Babcock came back. He was still the inspector of federal buildings. I didn't remove him from that, but he came back to the White House, and Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, was just horrified. He told me when he walked to visit, would call on me, and there's Babcock sitting in the desk outside my door. And he told me in no uncertain terms, Mr. President, that man's got to go. He's tainting you. And has drugged your whole family into this. There were implications that my brother Orville, that my brother-in-law Fred Dent, that my own son Fred Grant were all involved in this. Henderson, I removed him from the special prosecutor post because in interviewing or cross-examining one of the defendants in St. Louis, he implicated that I was actually involved, that this had come in the door of the executive residence and right into my office, that I could possibly be involved, if not directly, and in covering it up. So when I heard that, and I read that information from a sworn copy of the court records, even the cabinet said he's got to go. And that's when I removed him and replaced him with James Broadhead as special prosecutor. So my family's been involved. My character has been besmirched. My reputation has been irreparably damaged. And Fish said he's got to go. And I agreed with him. I removed him from the office. I didn't ask him to resign. Didn't remove him from the post as the inspector of federal buildings. But a couple of years later, or thereabouts, I removed him from that position and I named him as inspector of lighthouses for the 5th district. So he was removed from the very pinnacle of power, actually physically at my right hand outside my office door, to inspecting lighthouses along the coast, remote locations. And in fact, he drowned in the performance of his duties in 1884 at Mosquito Inlet in Florida. Some boat accident mishap, and he drowned. He was 48 years old. So the whiskey ring did me a great deal of damage politically, but we stopped the bilking of the government. 15 to 18 million gallons of whiskey produced annually. There was the 2/3 of it at best were being taxed. That 1/3 amounted to about $1.5 million conservatively estimated every year for several years from the mid 1860s into 1875. A tremendous criminal ring that became criminal. Started by Lincoln to finance the war, but it as taxes often not stopped. This one wasn't stopped when the war was over, and it became a Republican fundraiser, and then it became a criminal enterprise. And people all around me were found to be guilty. So I'm the first president to testify in the defense of a man charged with crimes against the government, the first president to appoint a special prosecutor, first president to fire that prosecutor and replace him, and to suffer also the slings and arrows of my closest confidant and friend, Orville Babcock, found to be as guilty as anyone else in the conspiracy. So by 1877, the whiskey ring was dead. That's all that I have to say about those reflections. It's painful to think about them, but the whiskey ring was one of the worst, personally I feel possibly the worst scandal that occurred during my administration. It happened right under my nose in the office next to mine by a man I trusted most. It was the most painful event in my life. For now, until we meet again for other reflections, I am Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States, bidding you from my parlor a fond adieu.